Disney's Treasury of Children's Classics presents Mickey's Christmas Carol. It was Christmas Eve in London. Large fluffy snowflakes were falling from the darkening sky, and the chilly streets were bustling with townsfolk hurrying home to sit together with their families by the fire. But not old Ebenezer Scrooge. He was trudging back to work, glaring disdainfully at the festive crowds. When he reached the counting house, his place of business, he used his cane to knock the snow from the sign above the door. It read, Scrooge and Marley, but Marley had been scratched out. "Poor Jacob Marley," Scrooge murmured, referring to his old partner. "Dead 7 years today. He was a good one. Robbed the widows and swindled the poor." He chuckled to himself. "In his will he left me enough money to pay for his tombstone. But I had him buried at sea." The little bell on the door jingled as he opened it.
"Cratchit!"
he snapped to his clerk, who was tossing a piece of coal on the grate.
"Wasting coal again?"
No, said Bob Cratchit. I was just trying to thaw out the ink." Scrooge jabbed the clerk with his cane.
"Bah!"
he cried.
"You used a piece of coal last week. Now get back to work."
Cratchit climbed back onto his high stool. "Speaking of work, Mr. Scrooge, tomorrow is, Christmas, and I was wondering, might I have the day off?"
"I suppose so," grumbled Scrooge. "But I'll have to dock you half a day's pay. And now let's see."
He scratched some numbers on a piece of paper with his old quill pen.
"I give you 2.5 shillings a day. That's after the raise I gave you 3 years ago."
"Yes, sir," explained Cratchit. "That's when I started doing your laundry." The door banged open.
"Merry Christmas!"
cried a young fellow, stamping the snow from his feet. "And Merry Christmas to you, Mr. Fred," said Bob Cratchit with a friendly nod.
"Bah, humbug!" muttered Scrooge. "And what brings you here, nephew?"
"I've come to invite you to Christmas dinner, Uncle," he said, handing him a wreath with a bright red bow.
"Oh, will you be having plum goose with chestnut dressing?"
asked Scrooge, tossing the wreath aside. "With plum pudding and lemon sauce, and candied fruits with spiced sugar cakes?"
"Yep,"
Fred said, beaming. "Will you come?"
"Are you deaf, boy?"
Scrooge cried.
"You know I can eat that stuff. Now get out, out, out!"
Bob Cratchit covered his ears as Scrooge slammed the door behind his nephew. Seconds later, the door opened again. This time, 2 townsfolk, holding little collection cups, peeked timidly inside. "Alms to the poor, Mrs. Scrooge?" one asked.
If I gave to the poor," Scrooge retorted gruffly, "they'd no longer be poor, would they?"
They stammered.
"Then you'd be out of a job, wouldn't you?" Scrooge continued. "Oh, don't ask me to put you out of a job, especially not on Christmas Eve."
"Oh, we wouldn't do that, Mr. Scrooge," they replied, and hurried out the door. Scrooge emptied a large bag of shiny gold coins on his desk, and smiling, began to count to himself. When he heard Bob Cratchit closing his books for the night, Scrooge glanced up at the clock.
"That old clock is 2 minutes fast," he said. "But never mind, Cratchit. You may leave 2 minutes early, but don't forget my laundry."
"Oh, you're so kind, sir," said Bob, grabbing his hat and scarf. He hoisted the bulky sack over his shoulder and staggered outside. Scrooge continued stacking his money until the clock struck 9. He locked the door and tramped home through the wet snow. As he unlatched the door to his house, he gaped in surprise at the door knocker. Before his very eyes, the brass lion head transformed into the face of his old partner.
"Jacob Marley?"
he gasped.
"Is that you?"
"Scrooge!" wailed the ghostly knocker.
"No, that can't be,"
said Scrooge. He pushed open the door and raced upstairs to his bedroom.
I must be overworked,"
he thought as he bolted the door and collapsed into a chair. He jumped right back up when he heard a jangling noise. The ghost of Jacob Marley, draped in chains, appeared through the closed door, tripped over Scrooge's cane, and stumbled into the room. "Scrooge!" the ghost moaned.
"Go away!"
cried Scrooge, cowering in his chair. The ghost clanked toward him. "Ebenezer, I've come to warn you. For being mean and stingy all my life, I'm forced to carry these heavy chains for all eternity, maybe even longer. I'm doomed. Unless you mend your ways, Ebenezer Scrooge, the same will happen to you." Scrooge eyed the rusty chains with fright.
"Oh, help me, Jacob," he begged. "Tell me what to do."
"Tonight, you'll be visited by 3 spirits," said Marley's ghost. "Do as they say, or your chains will be heavier than mine." The ghost drifted back through the closed door and fell clanking down the stairs. The sound of his chains vanished into the night.
"Gotta get some sleep,"
Scrooge muttered. He threw on his nightshirt and stocking cap, and before climbing under the covers, checked beneath the bed with a candle. By counting gold coins in his head, he managed to drift off to sleep. Ding, ding! Scrooge bolted up in his bed. A little green chap in a top hat was standing on the nightstand. He was hitting the alarm clock bell with his tiny umbrella.
"Good, you're awake," he said. Who are you?"
asked Scrooge, rubbing his eyes. The creature bowed.
"Why, I'm the ghost of Christmas past," he replied, and then hopped up to the open window. "Come on, Scrooge, let's go. We're going to visit your past." "I'm not going out there," Scrooge protested. "I'll fall."
But before he could say another word, Scrooge and the ghost were flying high in the dark sky over the snowy rooftops. They came to a landing in front of a familiar house. It was the old Fezziwig Tea Company. Peeking through a brightly lit window, Scrooge cried out in surprise.
"Why, it's Fezziwig playing his violin. He was my first boss, you know. And there are all of my very dearest friends."
He peered eagerly at the merry faces he once knew, recalling times he had long forgotten.
"And there I am, sitting in the corner," Scrooge said quietly. "I always was a shy lad."
Suddenly, he felt his heart jump.
There's lovely Isabel," he murmured. "She was my first and only love. This was the night I first kissed her under the mistletoe. How clearly I remember her pink silk dress and the satin ribbon in her hair."
His face took a sad and dreamy look.
"I wonder where my dearest Isabel is now."
"Married to another," replied the ghost of Christmas past. "And it's all your fault. You loved your gold more than you loved her, and so you lost her forever." Scrooge covered his ears.
I know,
he sobbed.
"Please, Spirit, take me home. I can't bear to watch any longer."
In a flash, he was back in his bed, weeping into a pillow.
"Why, oh why?"
he sniffled, pulling the quilt over his face.
"Why was I so foolish?"
"Fee-fi-fo-fum," boomed a voice. "Do I smell a stingy little Englishman?" Scrooge peeked out from the drapes covering his bed and was met by 2 enormous eyes staring back at him. They belonged to a giant who sat in the middle of the room. The giant, surrounded by dishes of scrumptious food, held up a slice of mincemeat pie. "I'm the ghost of Christmas present," he said to Scrooge. Want a bite?" Scrooge had never seen so many delicious things to eat. There were bunches of grapes, platters of roast meat, frosted cakes, and figgy puddings.
"Where did all this come from?"
he asked. "From the heart," said the ghost. "It's the food of generosity, something you've denied everyone you know."
"Bah, humbug," said Scrooge. "Nobody's ever shown me generosity."
"You've never given them reason to," responded the ghost. "Yet there are some who find enough warmth in their hearts even for the likes of you." The ghost picked up Scrooge between his fingers and dropped him into his roomy pocket. With his gigantic hand, he pushed up the roof and stepped out among the lamplit streets. "Here we are," he said, placing Scrooge down in front of a small, shabby-looking house.
"Why did you bring me to this old shack?"
demanded Scrooge, rubbing the frost from a window.
"Well, what do you know? It's Cratchit's place."
Inside, Bob Cratchit was helping his children hang popcorn on a scraggly Christmas tree. He watched Mrs. Cratchit place a measly portion of turkey on the table.
"Surely they must have more food than that," he said. "What's bubbling in that big pot?"
"Your laundry," answered the ghost. "Oh, look! Here comes their youngest child, Tiny Tim." A small, pale child, leaning on a makeshift crutch, hobbled down the stairs. When he reached the last step, Bob Cratchit picked up the tot, set him at the table, and tucked a napkin under his chin.
"Oh, Dad," cried Tiny Tim, "look at the wonderful dinner. We must thank Mr. Scrooge." "What's wrong with that kind lad?"
Scrooge whispered to the ghost. The ghost shook his head sadly. "Much, I'm afraid. If things remain as they are, I see an empty chair where Tiny Tim once sat." Scrooge shuddered.
"You mean to say—"
But the ghost of Christmas present was gone, and Scrooge was left alone in the snow.
"Don't go,"
he pleaded.
"Tell me about Tiny Tim."
The air grew thick with foul-smelling smoke, and Scrooge began to cough. He found to his horror that he was no longer at Cratchit's house, but in the town graveyard. A fat fellow in a red hood stood in front of him, puffing on a big cigar.
"Are you the ghost of Christmas future?"
Scrooge said, shivering with fear.
"If you are, please tell me what will happen to Tiny Tim."
The ghost pointed to a freshly dug grave. The Cratchit family stood huddled around it. Sobbing, Bob Cratchit hugged Tiny Tim's crutch to his chest. Before walking away, he gently leaned it against the headstone.
"Oh, no," groaned Scrooge. "I didn't want this to happen. Tell me this can all be changed."
Behind him, Scrooge heard voices. Nearby, 2 gravediggers were digging another grave.
"I've never seen a funeral like this one," said one. "No mourners or friends to bid the old bloke farewell. I think everybody was happy to see him go." "Ah, well,"
said the other.
"let's go rest for a minute before we drop him in."
Picking up the lantern and shovels, they ambled off. Scrooge went over and peered into the deep hole.
Whose lonely grave is this?"
he asked. The ghost of Christmas future struck a match on the headstone and lit a fresh cigar. Scrooge gasped as he read the name.
"It's my grave!"
The ghost laughed and slapped Scrooge hard on the back. "Help!" cried Scrooge, losing his balance and clutching wildly at the howling wind. Screaming, he tumbled headlong down into the bottomless grave.
"Spirit, let me out!" he pleaded. "I'll change!"
The laughter and the howling stopped suddenly, and Scrooge found himself back in his bed once again, tearing wildly at the sheets. Scrooge jumped up and flung open the window. The night had finally passed, and the sun was shining bright. Fresh snow sparkled in the streets, and church bells were ringing all over town.
"It's Christmas morning!" he shouted. "The spirits have given me another chance!"
Throwing on his coat and hat, he scampered out into the street. The alms collectors were standing on the corner.
"Something for you,"
said Scrooge. The 2 townsfolk stared in amazement as Scrooge dropped a handful of coins into their boxes. 50 gold sovereigns, they gasped.
"What, not enough?"
Scrooge asked. He giggled and dug into his bucket again.
"Here's 100 more."
He skipped down the street shouting, "Merry Christmas!" to everyone he passed.
"Hello there, Fred," he said, running into his nephew. "I'm looking forward to that wonderful Christmas dinner." "You mean you're coming?" asked Fred. "Really?" "Of course," said Scrooge. "Be sure to keep it piping hot."
"I will, Uncle Scrooge," Fred replied, "and a very Merry Christmas to you." Scrooge disappeared into the butcher's shop and the toy store. Toting 2 large sacks, he hurried to the Cratchit's house and rapped on the door.
"Mr. Scrooge?"
stammered Bob Cratchit when he opened the door.
Won't you come in?"
Then he saw the sacks.
"More laundry?"
he asked. Scrooge stepped inside.
"I've had enough of this day-off stuff, Cratchit," Scrooge shouted. "You leave me no alternative," he paused, "but to give you a raise." "A raise?" gasped Bob. "You mean it, sir?"
Scrooge nodded.
Yes. I mean, no, I'm giving you a raise and making you my new partner."
Then he ripped open the bag and pulled out a toy soldier. Smiling, he presented it to Tiny Tim. "Oh," Tiny Tim gasped, "for me?"
"There's something for your brother and sister too," said Scrooge. "In fact, this whole bag of toys is for you."
The children all cheered together in delight. "Thank you, sir," they exclaimed over and over. With a little bow, Scrooge handed Mrs. Cratchit the other bag. "And for you, my dear, a nice plump goose." Mrs. Cratchit beamed. "Oh, sir, how can we ever thank you?"
"You don't have to,"
said Scrooge. Bending down, he picked up Tiny Tim in his arms.
"We'll have this little fella well in no time."
Tears filled Bob Cratchit's eyes. "A very Merry Christmas to you, Mr. Scrooge." Tiny Tim threw his arms around Scrooge's neck. "And God bless us," he piped in his soft voice. "God bless us all, every one."